Surprised, a major shift just occurred inside the banking framework and practically nobody is discussing it. Your deposits, your retirement funds, your savings accounts, all connected to a decision most Americans will never discover. There's a 90-day window attached to it right now. And after watching this, you'll understand exactly why that timeline matters for every single dollar you have. Serious, a significant development just occurred within the banking framework and virtually nobody is discussing it. Not major media coverage, not urgent bulletins, not even a passing mention scrolling across your television screen. But behind secured doors, the regulations that are designed to safeguard your deposits were silently restructured. And here's the detail that should make you pause immediately. You currently have a 90-day timeline connected to that ruling, and the vast majority of individuals don't even realize it's there. This isn't regarding some theoretical policy conversation or something concealed within financial terminology that only impacts investment professionals. This affects your checking account, your savings, your retirement funds, anything linked to a financial institution. Because at the precise moment when the financial infrastructure is displaying indicators of tension again, the authorities in charge didn't strengthen the guidelines. They relaxed them, and they accomplished it without consulting you, without clarifying it, and without placing it where you'd actually notice it. The fundamental question isn't simply what was modified. It's why it was modified at this particular time and what that reveals about the infrastructure beneath everything you depend on. Because when you begin examining that connection, you don't merely discover one concern. You discover layers, 4 of them positioned directly above your deposits, each one altering how secure those deposits truly are. And once you observe all 4 combined, it becomes extremely difficult to view your bank balance the identical way again. What this presentation will accomplish is guide you through precisely what was modified using the real documentation, the decisions, and the figures without the sensationalism, without the alarm, and without presuming you possess expertise in financial matters. Because the reality is, the majority of this isn't complex. It's simply not communicated in straightforward language. And that distance between what's occurring and what individuals comprehend is where misunderstanding and vulnerability tends to exist. So, we're going to eliminate that distance. Progressively, you'll see how the framework was already organized before this ruling, what the revised regulation adjustment actually accomplishes, and why it's significant right now. Not theoretically, but in realistic terms that connect directly to your daily financial existence. And by the conclusion, you'll be equipped to perceive the complete picture clearly enough to form your own judgments about what steps to consider next. But to appreciate why this latest modification carries as much significance as it does, we need to begin with something most individuals never contemplate. What's truly occurring with your deposits the instant you place them inside a financial institution? The instant you place deposits into a financial institution, something significant and frequently misinterpreted occurs. It appears like you're positioning your cash somewhere protected, like it's resting there available for you whenever you require it. But in actuality, that's not how the framework functions anymore. And in certain respects, it hasn't functioned that way for an extended period. Back in March of 2020, the Federal Reserve reached a determination that fundamentally altered the architecture of banking across the United States. They decreased the reserve obligation to 0, not reduced it, removed it entirely. What that signifies in straightforward terms is that your financial institution is no longer legally obligated to retain a single dollar of your deposit available. Not a percentage, not a portion, 0. So when your salary arrives in your account, it doesn't merely rest there. It transforms into part of a considerably larger collection of capital that the institution can transfer, lend, invest, or allocate elsewhere. And under the existing regulations, there's no minimum quantity they must maintain in reserve in the event you or everyone else desires their deposits returned simultaneously. A straightforward way to visualize this is to picture a storage facility where you leave your automobile overnight. You expect it'll be there in the morning precisely where you positioned it. But in this version of the facility, there's no regulation requiring them to keep your automobile in your space or even within the building. Instead, they're permitted to lease it out while you're sleeping, transport it across the city, perhaps even across state boundaries, and when you return for it, the only method you retrieve your automobile is if sufficient other automobiles happen to be returned at the identical time. Most days, that arrangement functions adequately. Individuals arrive and depart, Automobiles rotate in and out, and nobody observes. But the complete architecture depends on one element, not everyone appearing simultaneously. That's the base your bank balance is constructed upon today. And what renders this more consequential is that this wasn't a temporary emergency provision that was reversed. It's still operational quietly, indefinitely, at minimum for the present. So that's layer one. Your deposits feel like they're present, but architecturally they aren't remaining stationary in the manner most individuals envision. Now, layer two constructs directly upon that foundation. And this is where the guidelines transition from how institutions function to what occurs if something malfunctions. Because following the financial emergency in 2008, there was enormous opposition against taxpayer-supported rescues. Hundreds of billions of dollars were utilized to stabilize major institutions, and the public reaction was emphatic and unambiguous. Never again. So legislators intervened and reconstructed the framework. On the exterior, it appeared like a victory. No additional rescues utilizing taxpayer funds. But what substituted it is something most individuals have never had properly described to them. It's designated a bail-in. And the distinction isn't merely procedural, it's individual. In a bail-in circumstance, if a significant institution encounters difficulty, it doesn't extend outward to taxpayers for assistance. It extends inward into its own architecture. That encompasses bondholders, shareholders, and crucially depositors, which means individuals with funds in the institution. Because legally, when you deposit cash, you're not preserving it in a secure container with your identification on it. You're lending it to the institution. In exchange, they provide you a claim, a figure on a display, but not possession of particular physical currency. In legal terminology, you become what's designated an unsecured creditor. And that designation matters because it establishes your position if circumstances begin to deteriorate. You're part of the framework that can be utilized to stabilize the institution itself. Now, this is typically where individuals respond, certainly, but that's precisely why we have FDIC coverage. And that's a reasonable observation because up to a specified threshold, that safeguard has functioned historically. It's been dependable, steady, and for generations, it's accomplished precisely what it was engineered to accomplish. But once you begin examining closely at how that framework is organized today, particularly in the context of everything else we're examining through, you begin to perceive why that comfort might not be as unconditional as it appears on the exterior. And that's where the subsequent layer commences. Because the genuine question isn't whether safeguarding exists, it's whether it's constructed to manage the variety of strain the framework is experiencing now. So, let's examine directly at that safeguard because this is where the discussion transitions from how the framework operates to whether the mathematics underlying it actually sustains examination. The FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, is the safety mechanism most individuals depend on without questioning twice. It's the explanation you'll hear your deposits are protected up to $250,000. And historically, that declaration has been accurate in application. Since its establishment in 1933, the FDIC has intervened and protected insured depositors every single occasion it's been examined. That history matters, but what additionally matters, particularly right now, is the magnitude of what it's guaranteeing compared to what it actually possesses accessible. As of present, the FDIC maintains approximately $129 billion in its coverage fund. That appears like an enormous figure, and independently, it is. But the total quantity of deposits it protects exceeds $10 trillion. When you analyze that proportion, it calculates to approximately $1.17 reserved for every $100 it guarantees. And that's not an insignificant discrepancy. That's the architecture. The framework isn't engineered to protect everything simultaneously. It's engineered around the presumption that it won't need to, that difficulties will be contained, controllable, and distributed over time. And the majority of the time that presumption holds. But when tension begins to accumulate across multiple organizations simultaneously, that's when the distance between perception and actuality becomes more challenging to dismiss. We received an indication of that in 2023 when several significant regional institutions collapsed in rapid succession. In order to protect insured depositors, the FDIC had to extend beyond its existing reserves and obtain approximately $93 billion. Consider what that suggests for a moment. The framework that protects your deposits had to obtain borrowed funds to satisfy the coverage it had already committed. Again, that doesn't signify collapse is unavoidable, but it does expose how precisely calibrated the framework truly is. It operates until it's compelled to extend, and when it extends, it relies on external assistance, coordination, and precise timing. So now, if you retreat and examine the initial two layers combined, your deposits not being obligated to remain in reserve and the coverage framework functioning on proportional support, you begin to observe a sequence. It's not about one vulnerable element. It's about how those elements interact under strain. And that delivers us to the third layer. Because even within that framework, if something does malfunction, there's another particular detail that most individuals never anticipate encountering. It's not merely whether your deposits are safeguarded. It's where you're positioned in sequence to retrieve them. Because in an institution resolution circumstance, there's a ranking, a legal sequence that establishes who receives compensation first, who receives compensation later, and who may ultimately absorb losses. And here's where things become less straightforward. The financial agreements that institutions utilize to administer risk, instruments like derivatives, are provided special precedents under existing regulations. In basic terms, that signifies those commitments can be resolved before depositors are completely compensated. Now, derivatives might appear abstract, but the magnitude is anything but. We're discussing tens of trillions of dollars committed in these instruments across significant financial organizations. Individual institutions can maintain exposures in the tens of trillions independently. And across the framework, the aggregate climbs even further. So when you envision a queue forming during an emergency, individuals anticipating access to their savings, you're not positioned at the front of that queue. You're positioned behind an enormous layer of financial commitments that were never part of your routine banking experience, but are profoundly integrated in the framework your institution operates within. And if that still appears hypothetical, there's a documented example that demonstrates how this can develop. In 2013, Cyprus experienced a banking emergency that compelled precisely this variety of reorganization. Depositors awoke to discover that a considerable portion of their funds, particularly amounts exceeding protected thresholds, had been transformed into shares of struggling institutions. Access to accounts was limited. Cash machines were emptied within days. Institutions remained shuttered for weeks, and capital restrictions remained active for years. And more than a decade afterward, some depositors are still attempting to recover what they forfeited. That wasn't a peripheral framework or an isolated trial. That was a contemporary banking environment with centralized supervision and deposit protection frameworks established. So when you merge everything we've addressed so far, the architecture of deposits, the constraints of coverage, and the precedent sequence in an emergency, you begin to recognize that the framework isn't constructed on a singular assurance. It's constructed on a collection of presumptions. Presumptions about timing, conduct, and equilibrium. And as long as those presumptions maintain, everything appears robust. But when they're challenged, that's when the foundational mechanics begin to matter in ways most individuals never anticipated. Now, if all of this still appears like something that exists predominantly in documentation, procedural, remote, improbable to actually materialize in a practical circumstance, then what follows next is where that viewpoint begins to transform. Because some of the most transparent observations into how the framework actually perceives these vulnerabilities didn't originate from skeptics or external observers. They originated from within the chamber. In November of 2022, the FDIC conducted a restricted meeting that was subsequently made publicly accessible on their official website. It assembled senior officials, individuals with extensive connections to significant institutions, former leaders from organizations like Goldman Sachs, and experienced policy architects who've invested decades inside the financial framework. And during that conversation, something was expressed that infrequently gets communicated this candidly. One participant acknowledged officially that depositors could be vulnerable in an emergency, that bail-ins are not merely conceptual, but part of the architecture. But in the identical moment, the concern wasn't about whether the framework permitted that. It was about how much the general population should comprehend. Because if individuals fully understood how these processes function, it could activate the very phenomenon the framework is engineered to prevent, an erosion of confidence. And that's the term everything depends upon: confidence. Because contemporary banking frameworks don't merely operate on capital, they operate on trust. The presumption that your deposits will be accessible when you require them. The conviction that the architecture underneath is stable enough not to interrogate. And once that conviction begins to fracture, conduct changes. Individuals relocate funds. They pose different inquiries. They cease assuming. And that transformation alone can generate strain. Another participant in that identical conversation articulated it even more precisely, indicating that there's essentially two audiences. There's the institutional component, significant participants who comprehend how the framework operates in specifics. And then there's everyone else. And the suggestion was that those who genuinely want to comprehend will discover a method to comprehend, but it's not something extensively highlighted. When you interpret that beyond policy terminology, it discloses something significant. The framework relies on most individuals not investigating too profoundly into its internal operations, not because there's a singular concealed deficiency, but because the complete picture is intricate, and intricacy can modify conduct if it's abruptly brought into awareness. And that delivers us directly into what recently occurred. Because against that context, where confidence is already a crucial variable, the individuals supervising the framework reached a determination that progresses in a very particular trajectory. On March 19, 2026, three principal regulatory authorities, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, voted on a collection of modifications connected to what's generally recognized as Basel III. The designation itself isn't significant. What's important is what these regulations were initially engineered to accomplish. After the 2008 financial emergency, regulators acknowledged that institutions required more robust protections, additional capital maintained in reserve to absorb losses if conditions deteriorated. So, they established more stringent requirements, particularly for the most substantial organizations, to ensure there was a cushion between instability and depositor consequences. That was the arrangement for more than a decade. Greater resilience, enhanced safeguarding, expanded margin for miscalculation. But in this most recent vote, that trajectory shifted. The revised regulations permit large institutions to function with comparatively less of that protective cushion. In other terms, the very protection that was intended to absorb disruptions before they reach the public has been diminished. And this didn't occur during a period of complete tranquility. It's occurring at a time when multiple financial measurements are already displaying strain, when interest rates are elevated, when international markets are recalibrating, when liquidity circumstances are more restricted than they've been in years. Now, to be precise, this isn't being characterized by regulators as eliminating safety entirely. The reasoning is that the framework has matured, that institutions are better situated, that adaptability is necessary. But when you position that determination alongside everything we've already examined, the zero reserve obligation, the architecture of deposit coverage, the precedence hierarchy in a resolution, it becomes component of a broader sequence. Not a singular modification in isolation, but a series of recalibrations that all progress in the identical trajectory. Less immediate safeguarding at the juncture where tension would be experienced first. And here's where that 90-day timeline we referenced at the very outset returns to prominence. Because this determination isn't completely secured yet, there's an official comment period accessible right now where the public can respond before the regulations are completed. Most individuals will never encounter it. Most won't understand where to search. But it exists. And once that timeline concludes, the architecture we've just described doesn't merely remain conceptual. It becomes the established framework progressing forward. That 90-day timeline isn't merely a procedural step in the process. It's one of the limited moments where something like this is temporarily visible before it becomes permanent. Right now, there's a public comment period accessible on the Federal Register. Anyone can submit a response. Not exclusively organizations, not exclusively advocates, anyone. And by regulation, those comments must be evaluated as part of the rulemaking procedure. Now, whether they alter the result is an entirely different question, but the existence of that timeline communicates something significant. This isn't completely finalized yet. It's in that narrow phase where consciousness genuinely matters, because once that timeline concludes, the transition we've been discussing The diminished cushion, the recalibrated protections moves from proposal to established policy. And at that juncture, it becomes part of the foundational presumptions the framework operates on, quietly, permanently. No proclamation, no prominent moment where someone describes it in straightforward language. It merely becomes the revised standard. And historically, that's how many of the most consequential financial transitions occur. Not with a singular dramatic disclosure, but through incremental recalibrations that only become apparent when you reflect retrospectively. So the question becomes, if this is occurring now in this climate, what are the individuals nearest to the framework doing with that identical information? Because one of the most reliable indicators in financial history isn't what's communicated publicly. It's how capital transitions privately. And when you begin examining in that trajectory, a pattern begins to surface that's difficult to disregard. Over the previous year, one of the most carefully observed investors globally has been executing a series of transitions that distinguish themselves. Not because they forecast the future with certainty, but because of their magnitude and timing. Over multiple quarters, hundreds of millions of shares in significant banking organizations were liquidated. Not simultaneously, not in desperation, but methodically, consistently in volume. At the identical time, that capital wasn't immediately redirected into other risk-intensive sectors. It was maintained, positioned, accumulated into an enormous cash allocation. Hundreds of billions of dollars remaining on the periphery. Now, that doesn't automatically signify something is about to fracture. Markets are sophisticated, and there are invariably multiple explanations behind substantial portfolio determinations. But context is relevant because alongside those transitions, internal perspectives within the banking sphere have additionally begun drawing comparisons that haven't been articulated in an extended period. Specifically parallels to the period preceding the 2007 to 2008 financial emergency. Not identical circumstances, but comparable patterns in how different measurements are aligning simultaneously. Elements like sustained elevated energy costs, a robust dollar index, strain on equity markets, and climbing long-term bond returns. Independently, each of these can be controlled. But when multiple measurements begin progressing together, they can generate feedback cycles, restricting financial circumstances in ways that extend across the framework. And according to some of the researchers nearest to the banking sector, several of those indicators have already been activated, while others are approaching closely. So when you retreat and examine the complete picture, you begin to observe two concurrent paths. On one aspect, regulatory recalibrations that diminish certain protections. On the other, substantial capital transitions that suggest a more cautious positioning from those monitoring most attentively. And precisely in the center of those two paths is where most individuals are standing, still functioning under presumptions that haven't completely aligned with what's transforming underneath. When you arrange everything together, not separately, but simultaneously, the picture becomes considerably more transparent. You have a framework where institutions are no longer obligated to maintain reserves against your deposits. Above that, the coverage engineered to safeguard those deposits functions on a fraction of the aggregated guarantees. Then, in an extreme circumstance, there's a legal architecture that establishes who receives compensation first, and depositors aren't necessarily at the beginning of that sequence. And now, layered across all of it, the very protections that were reinforced after the previous significant emergency are being recalibrated in a manner that diminishes the protection between instability and consequence. None of these components independently automatically produce an emergency. That's essential to express clearly. But frameworks aren't examined one component at a time. They're examined simultaneously under strain and practical circumstances that don't adhere to a predetermined plan. And simultaneously, you're observing indicators subtle but persistent from within the financial sphere itself. Capital transitioning risk being recalculated. Language from insiders that reflects earlier periods of tension. Again, not forecasts, not certainties, but measurements. And when multiple measurements begin to indicate in the identical trajectory, the wisest approach isn't to overreact. It's to remain attentive. Because the genuine vulnerability for most individuals isn't that they'll observe something approaching and respond excessively. It's that they won't observe it whatsoever until they're compelled to respond. So instead of regarding all of this as something remote or theoretical, the more practical inquiry becomes, What can you genuinely accomplish with this knowledge? Not in a dramatic all-or-nothing manner, but in straightforward, grounded measures that align your comprehension with how the framework genuinely operates today. The initial measure is transparency, understanding precisely how much of your deposits are protected under FDIC coverage and how much isn't. And that's not something you need to speculate about. There's an instrument for it. The FDIC's own electronic deposit insurance calculator lets you chart every account you maintain across organizations and observe where you're positioned. Because one of the most prevalent presumptions is that protection applies per account. But in actuality, it's organized per depositor, per institution within particular ownership classifications. And that distinction matters more than most individuals appreciate. The second measure is diversification. If you discover that you're maintaining amounts exceeding protected thresholds at a singular organization, one of the most direct ways to diminish vulnerability is to distribute those funds across multiple institutions or account classifications. It's not complicated. It doesn't require forecasting anything about the future, and it aligns your arrangement with the regulations that already exist. The third measure is viewpoint, reconsidering the presumption that a conventional bank account is the sole or inherently most secure location to maintain all of your accessible funds. There are other instruments, other architectures, each with their own considerations. But the essential point is comprehending that secure isn't a permanent designation. It relies on how the framework surrounding it is organized at any particular moment. And none of this is about attempting to outmaneuver the framework or predict a particular occurrence. It's about eliminating awareness gaps, because once you comprehend how these layers connect together, you're no longer functioning purely on presumption. You're forming decisions with visibility. And that independently transforms how you interact with your deposits in a substantial way. And once you begin examining the framework through that perspective where architecture matters equally as much as headlines, you start to observe something additional. Banking isn't the sole domain where quiet modifications are occurring beneath the surface. It's merely one component of a considerably larger arrangement, because the identical variety of strain we've been discussing, restricting circumstances, transitioning regulations, increasing reliance on confidence, is appearing in other areas of the economy. Additionally, credit markets, real estate, sovereign obligations, even how liquidity transitions internationally, they're all interconnected. And when those interconnections begin to strain simultaneously, the consequences don't remain isolated in one location. That doesn't signify everything collapses. It signifies the framework adjusts. It reorganizes, sometimes progressively, sometimes simultaneously. And the individuals who navigate those periods most effectively aren't the ones responding to headlines after the occurrence. They're the ones who comprehend the foundational mechanics early enough to recalibrate before it becomes apparent. That's genuinely what this reduces to. Not forecasting a breakdown, not presuming the worst, but acknowledging that the foundation isn't permanent. It develops. And right now it's transitioning in ways that most individuals haven't been demonstrated clearly, because contemplate how this complete situation developed. A vote occurred, regulations were recalibrated, a 90-day timeline opened, and unless you actively searched for it, unless you examined regulatory documents or followed particular channels like US Visa and Green Card Info, you probably never observed it. No significant coverage, no extensive explanation, no moment where someone analyzed it in straightforward terms for everyday individuals whose lives are directly connected to it. And that distance, that space between what's occurring and what's extensively comprehended, is where the most substantial disconnect typically exists. So the genuine conclusion here isn't merely about financial institutions. It's about consciousness. It's about comprehending that the frameworks you depend on don't broadcast every significant modification in a manner that's simple to observe. Sometimes the most consequential transitions are the quiet ones. The ones that don't interrupt your routine, don't activate a notification, don't demand your attention, but still reshape the environment you're functioning in. And right now, you're in one of those moments, a limited timeline where something consequential has transformed, where there's still opportunity to comprehend it, still opportunity to examine your own situation, still opportunity to determine how you want to respond before it simply becomes the revised baseline that everyone adjusts to afterward.